The Los Angeles airport was alive with its usual chaos, lines stretching endlessly, announcements echoing, and travelers rushing past one another. Amid the frenzy stood Keanu Reeves, calm and composed, dressed in simple attire that seemed to make him invisible among the polished elite of the first-class line. Nearby, a sharply dressed man noticed him, his eyes narrowing with disdain. Little did he know, this flight was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The first-class line bustled with a quiet sense of exclusivity. Designer bags rested on manicured hands, polished shoes tapped on the gleaming airport floor, and voices hummed with muted confidence. Keanu Reeves, however, was a striking contrast to the luxury around him. His plaid shirt, worn jeans, and well-traveled backpack exuded simplicity, as if he were just another ordinary traveler. Keanu stood patiently, his calm demeanor seeming to create a bubble of tranquility amid the hurried energy. To those who noticed him, he didn't seem to fit the mold of a typical first-class passenger. But while most either ignored or admired his understated presence, one man, standing just behind him, was less than impressed. Victor Harding, dressed in a tailored suit that seemed designed to announce his importance, eyed Keanu with barely concealed disdain. His every movement, from adjusting his Rolex to flicking imaginary dust off his lapel, screamed superiority. "First class, huh?" Victor said, his voice tinged with mockery. "Never know who might show up in this line these days." Keanu turned his head slightly, meeting Victor's gaze with a calm expression. "The world is full of surprises," he replied, his tone light and unbothered. Victor frowned, clearly expecting a different reaction. The lack of defensiveness threw him off, but he quickly recovered, leaning in slightly as if to emphasize his point. "Nothing personal, of course," he said, smirking. "You just don't look like the type who usually flies like this." Keanu smiled faintly. Sometimes looks can be deceiving. The line began to move, and the two men advanced toward the boarding gate. Victor's smirk deepened as he watched Keanu walk ahead, his confident strides juxtaposed with Keanu's unassuming pace. Yet, something about Keanu's serenity seemed to gnaw at Victor, though he couldn't quite place why. The boarding call for first class was announced, and the two men entered the plane, their interaction far from over. What neither of them knew was that this flight would become an unexpected turning point. As passengers filed into the luxurious first-class cabin, Victor couldn't help but feel a swell of pride as he located his seat. The plush leather, the expansive legroom, the personalized service. It all validated the image he worked tirelessly to project. But his satisfaction was short-lived. Upon checking his ticket one last time, Victor froze. His assigned seat was directly beside Keanu Reeves. "You've got to be kidding me," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head in disbelief. As Keanu placed his backpack under the seat and settled in with practiced ease, Victor sank into his own seat, visibly irritated. Of all the places, Victor thought bitterly, it had to be here. Keanu turned to him with a polite smile. "Looks like we're travel companions for this flight," he said warmly. Victor forced a tight-lipped smile, his annoyance bubbling just beneath the surface. "Yeah, lucky me," he said, the sarcasm evident. As the other passengers settled in and the cabin crew began their pre-flight preparations, Victor made a show of organizing his things, pulling out his tablet and scrolling aimlessly. He glanced sideways at Keanu, who simply leaned back in his seat, taking in his surroundings with quiet contentment. The disparity between them couldn't have been more pronounced. Victor, with his tailored suit and constant need to assert himself, seemed to embody the high-powered, fast-paced world he lived in. Keanu, on the other hand, radiated a calm self-assurance that required no embellishment. As the plane taxied down the runway and the flight attendants completed their final checks, Victor decided to strike up a conversation, not out of politeness, but out of curiosity laced with a hint of disdain. "So," Victor began, his tone casual but probing, "what do you do for a living?" Keanu turned to him, his expression open and friendly. "I work in film." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, film? Commercials? Indie projects?" Keanu chuckled softly. "Something like that." Victor leaned back, his smirk returning. "Well, good for you. It's nice to see people chasing their dreams, even if it's just for small-time gigs." Keanu didn't bite. He simply nodded, his calm demeanor unshaken. Everyone's journey is different, he said simply. Victor, clearly frustrated by Keanu's lack of defensiveness, leaned in slightly. You know, he said, his voice lowering, there are certain spaces that aren't meant for everyone, like first class, for instance. Keanu met Victor's gaze, his expression unchanged. I think everyone belongs where they are, he said softly, and sometimes we're exactly where we need to be. Victor scoffed, leaning back in his seat with an exaggerated chuckle. Philosophical, huh? Real life isn't that simple. Keanu turned his attention back to the window, the conversation seemingly over. But Victor wasn't done yet. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the cabin lights dimmed, Victor decided to push further, unable to resist testing Keanu's unshakable calm. The flight attendant approached to take drink orders, and Victor saw another opportunity. I'll have a glass of your best champagne, he said, his voice louder than necessary. Something that matches the exclusivity of this cabin. The attendant nodded with a practiced smile and turned to Keanu. And for you, sir? Keanu glanced up, his expression easy. Just water, please. Victor let out a low chuckle, leaning toward Keanu once the flight attendant moved on. Water? Really? You're flying first class and you're settling for water? That's different? Keanu smiled faintly, his tone as calm as ever. Sometimes simplicity is enough. Victor's smirk deepened. Yeah, I guess that works for people who don't know how to enjoy the best life has to offer. Keanu took a sip of his water as it was delivered, offering a polite nod to the flight attendant. He didn't respond to Victor's comment immediately, and the silence between them stretched uncomfortably. Victor shifted in his seat, clearly expecting a reaction that never came. The quiet tension drew the attention of nearby passengers. A young couple sitting a row ahead exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of curiosity and mild discomfort. Even the flight attendant cast a wary look toward Victor as she passed by. Finally, Keanu broke the silence. You know, he began, his voice low but steady, sometimes the best things in life aren't what you show off. They're what you carry with you. Victor frowned, caught off guard by the unexpected response. What's that supposed to mean? He asked, his tone sharp. Keanu's gaze remained steady. It means that real value isn't always about what's on the surface. Sometimes it's about the things you can't see. Integrity, kindness, how you treat people. Victor laughed dismissively, waving a hand. That's nice in theory, but the real world doesn't work like that. In the real world, it's all about power, status, and proving your worth. Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying Victor with quiet curiosity. And what do you think happens when all of that is gone? Victor's confident demeanor faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered. Well, that's not something I plan to worry about. Keanu leaned back in his seat, letting the conversation rest for the moment. But the passengers around them, who had been quietly eavesdropping, were now fully invested in the exchange. The tension in the first-class cabin was palpable, though it was cloaked in the guise of casual indifference. Victor, still basking in his self-assured philosophy, couldn't help but feel as though he was winning some unspoken debate. Yet, Keanu's unshaken calmness gnawed at him like a splinter he couldn't quite remove. You know, Victor began again, his voice carrying just enough volume to draw the attention of a few nearby passengers. People love to talk about things like humility and simplicity, but let's be honest, those things don't get you anywhere. Keanu, who had been gazing out the window, turned to face Victor. His expression was soft, unthreatening, but his words carried a quiet strength. Maybe they don't get you ahead in the way you're thinking, but they do something far more important. Victor raised an eyebrow. And what's that? They connect you to others, Keanu replied. They remind us that we're not so different, no matter how much we try to separate ourselves. Victor smirked, shaking his head. That's a nice sentiment, but I've built my life on standing out, not blending in. You wouldn't understand. Keanu didn't respond right away. Instead, he took a sip of his water, letting Victor's words hang in the air. The flight attendant passed by, discreetly collecting empty glasses, her eyes darting between the two men. The nearby passengers, now more openly attentive, waited for Keanu's reply. Maybe you're right, Keanu said finally, his tone even. Maybe I don't understand your world, but I've seen enough to know that standing out doesn't always mean standing tall. Victor's smirk faltered slightly, though he quickly masked it with a dismissive chuckle. That's poetic, but in the real world, it's about what you can show. Success isn't silent, it demands attention. Keanu tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. Does it? Or does it just speak for itself? Victor opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The simple question, posed so calmly, seemed to disarm him. The murmurs from the surrounding passengers grew louder, their subtle nods and exchanged glances hinting at a growing shift in favor of Keanu's perspective. A middle-aged woman across the aisle leaned over to her seatmate, whispering, "He's got a point. You don't have to shout about success for it to be real." Victor noticed the attention their exchange had garnered, and for the first time, his confidence wavered. His posture stiffened, and he adjusted his tie as if to regain control of the situation. But Keanu, as always, remained unbothered, his presence quietly commanding without needing to say much. Victor shifted in his seat, the weight of the conversation and the eyes of the passengers pressing down on him. His once relaxed confidence now felt like a fragile mask, threatening to crack under Keanu's calm yet pointed responses. He straightened his suit jacket, forcing a smile as he turned toward Keanu. "You've got an interesting perspective," Victor said, his voice laced with forced politeness. "But let's be honest, success is about results, not ideas. It's what you can show the world that matters." Keanu regarded him with a patient gaze, his tone as steady as ever. "And what happens when the world stops watching?" Victor's smile faltered. The question hit deeper than he expected, and for a moment, he didn't have an answer. He glanced around, noticing the passengers who were now openly listening. Some nodded subtly in agreement with Keanu's words, while others watched Victor with expressions of curiosity and judgment. Trying to regain control, Victor leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't mean to sound harsh, but the world is competitive. If you don't show your value, someone else will. That's just how it works." Keanu nodded slowly, as though considering Victor's point. "I understand that competition drives a lot of what we do, but I've also learned that what really matters isn't what you show, it's what you leave behind." Victor frowned. "Leave behind? What does that even mean?" Keanu smiled faintly. "It means the impact you have on others, the way you make them feel. In the end, it's not about what you achieve for yourself, but how you lift others along the way." The surrounding passengers exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting a growing sense of admiration for Keanu's words. Even the flight attendant, who had been quietly refilling drinks, paused to listen, her eyes softening as she watched the exchange. Victor, on the other hand, struggled to mask his frustration. "That's a nice thought," he said with a forced laugh, "but it's not exactly practical. The world doesn't reward kindness." "Doesn't it?" Keanu asked, his voice gentle but firm. "Maybe not in the ways you're used to measuring success, but kindness has a way of creating ripples you might never see." Victor opened his mouth to respond, but stopped himself, his words catching in his throat. Something about Keanu's calm conviction unsettled him, forcing him to reflect in ways he hadn't anticipated. The flight continued in silence for a while, but the atmosphere in the cabin had shifted. The passengers around them no longer saw Victor as the confident, self-assured man he tried to portray. Instead, their attention turned to Keanu, whose quiet strength and thoughtful words had left a far greater impression. The cabin settled into a quiet hum, the conversation seemingly over. Victor stared ahead, his jaw tight, while Keanu returned to his calm observance of the world outside the window. Nearby, passengers whispered amongst themselves, the tension in the air not entirely gone. A short while later, a flight attendant approached Keanu with a polite but slightly nervous smile. "Excuse me, Mr. Reeves," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough for nearby passengers to hear. "The captain asked me to let you know that your connection in Tokyo is confirmed. He also sends his regards." The name echoed like a pin dropping in a silent room. Reeves. Heads turned almost in unison as realization dawned on the passengers. The murmurs began immediately, growing louder as people exchanged surprised glances. Some gasped, while others fumbled to discreetly look up Keanu Reeves on their phones to confirm their suspicions. Victor froze, his mind scrambling to process the revelation. He turned slowly toward Keanu, his confident facade now replaced with wide-eyed disbelief. "Wait," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're that Keanu Reeves?" Keanu turned to face him, his expression as calm as ever. "I am," he replied simply, the words carrying neither pride nor humility, just fact. Victor blinked, his cheeks flushing as the weight of the moment crashed down on him. He opened his mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. He glanced around, noticing the passengers who had been observing their earlier exchange. Many of them now looked at Victor with thinly veiled disapproval. I didn't know," Victor managed finally, his voice trembling slightly. "I mean, if I'd known who you were—" Keanu raised a hand, gently interrupting him. "You don't need to know someone's name to treat them with respect," he said, his tone calm but firm. "Who I am doesn't change what's right." Victor slumped back in his seat, visibly deflated. The realization of how he had acted, and in front of someone so widely admired, settled over him like a heavy blanket. The whispers in the cabin continued, but this time, they weren't about Keanu's simplicity. They were about Victor's arrogance and the sharp contrast between the two men. Victor sat in silence, his confidence completely shattered. The weight of Keanu's words echoed in his mind. You don't need to know someone's name to treat them with respect. For the first time in a long while, Victor felt exposed, his carefully crafted image stripped away. The murmurs around the cabin began to quiet as the other passengers settled into their own thoughts. Yet, their subtle glances toward Victor carried an unspoken judgment. He shifted uncomfortably, aware of how drastically the tide had turned. Keanu, however, seemed completely at ease. He leaned back in his seat, taking a slow sip of water, his calm presence unshaken by the attention or the tension that lingered in the air. Victor finally found the courage to speak. "I need to apologize," he said, his voice quiet and uncharacteristically humble. "Not because of who you are, but because of how I acted. I was out of line." Keanu turned to him, his expression soft but serious. "Apology accepted," he said. "But more importantly, I hope you take something from this." Victor nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to his hands. "I will," he murmured, his tone sincere. "I don't know what got into me." Keanu offered a faint smile. "Sometimes, it's not about what gets into us. It's about what's already there, things we might not have faced yet." Victor frowned, the words hitting closer to home than he cared to admit. He was used to dismissing moments like this, brushing off introspection in favor of maintaining his polished image. But now, sitting beside someone who embodied quiet strength and humility, he found it impossible to ignore. The flight attendant returned, offering Keanu a refill of water. She smiled warmly, clearly in awe of him, but he accepted it with the same polite demeanor he'd shown throughout the flight. The interaction was brief, yet it underscored everything Victor had struggled to grasp. True respect didn't demand attention. It simply existed. Nearby, a passenger leaned over to whisper to his seatmate, "You'd never think someone like him would be so down to earth." Victor overheard the comment, and it stung, not because it was untrue, but because it highlighted how far he'd strayed from those qualities himself. The plane continued its steady journey, the hum of the engines filling the cabin as the passengers settled into an uneasy quiet. Victor remained lost in thought, his earlier bravado now replaced by introspection. He glanced at Keanu, who had returned to looking out the window, his expression serene, as if the entire exchange hadn't weighed on him at all. Victor's mind raced. For years, he had built his life around appearances, being seen, being respected, and, most importantly, being admired. Yet, sitting next to someone who carried none of those airs yet commanded more respect than Victor could dream of. He began to see the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Keanu turned slightly, catching Victor's gaze. "You okay?" he asked, his tone genuine. Victor hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, He stopped, unsure of how to express the turmoil in his mind. "You're different from what I expected." Keanu smiled faintly. "People often are." Victor let out a dry chuckle, leaning back in his seat. "You've probably dealt with people like me a lot. People who think they know everything." Keanu's expression didn't change. "I've met all kinds of people, but it's not about what they know. It's about what they're willing to learn." The words lingered in the air, their simplicity carrying a depth that struck Victor harder than he cared to admit. He looked down at his hands, turning his wedding band absent-mindedly. For the first time in years, he felt small, not in a belittling way, but in a way that made him question the choices that had brought him here. As the flight attendants began preparing for the descent, Victor took a deep breath. "Look, I don't say this often, but thank you." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For not letting me get away with it," Victor admitted. "I've spent so long trying to prove myself to everyone that I forgot what really matters." Keanu nodded slowly, his gaze steady. "It's never too late to figure that out." Victor leaned back in his seat, his thoughts swirling as the plane began its gradual descent. Around him, the passengers who had been silently observing the exchange seemed to relax, as though the lesson Keanu had imparted wasn't just for Victor, but for everyone. As the plane began its final approach, the tension that had filled the cabin earlier seemed to dissipate. Victor sat quietly, his usual air of self-assurance replaced by something more contemplative. His gaze wandered to the other passengers, many of whom were stealing glances at Keanu with subtle smiles of admiration. It was clear that the room had shifted, away from judgment and toward quiet respect. The flight attendant returned, offering Keanu a final round of water. "Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Reeves," she said softly, her words carrying a note of sincerity. Keanu smiled warmly. "Just doing my part," he replied, his tone as unassuming as ever. Victor observed the interaction, the simplicity of it hitting him harder than he expected. For years, he had believed that respect had to be demanded, earned through displays of power or wealth. Yet here was Keanu, receiving it effortlessly, not because of his fame, but because of how he carried himself. As the plane touched down and passengers began gathering their belongings, Victor turned to Keanu one last time. "I owe you more than an apology," he said quietly. "I owe you a thank you." Keanu looked at him, his expression kind but serious. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just remember, every day is a chance to be better than the day before." Victor nodded, the words settling deep into his thoughts. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar: hope. The plane reached the gate, and passengers began filing out of the cabin. Victor lingered, watching as Keanu moved with his usual calm demeanor, pausing occasionally to smile at fans who recognized him and approached for a quick word or photo. There was no pretense, no rush, just a quiet authenticity that resonated with everyone he interacted with. As Victor stepped off the plane and into the bustling terminal, he found himself walking slower than usual, his mind replaying the events of the flight. He had boarded that plane convinced he was in control, the master of his own narrative. But Keanu's quiet strength and humility had challenged everything he thought he knew. He spotted a mother struggling with her luggage while trying to keep her two young children in check. Normally, Victor would have walked past without a second thought, but this time, he paused. He stepped forward, offering a hand. "Let me help you with that," he said, surprising even himself. The woman smiled gratefully. "Thank you. That's very kind of you." Victor felt a warmth he hadn't experienced in years. A small act, but one that felt significant. As he walked away, he noticed a man nearby watching the scene unfold. The man gave Victor a slight nod of approval before disappearing into the crowd. Victor's thoughts returned to Keanu's parting words. Every day is a chance to be better than the day before. He realized that change didn't have to be dramatic or loud. It could start with something as simple as choosing kindness in the smallest of moments. As he exited the terminal, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm glow over the city. Victor took a deep breath, feeling lighter than he had in years. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he was open to discovering it. This story reminds us that respect and humility are timeless virtues. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed your perspective? Share your story in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring tales.